So the clip you've just seen is from the movie Silence, based on the same novel by Sushaku Endo. It's a Martin Scorsese movie starring Liam Neeson, Andrew Garfield, and some others. And it portrays persecution in Japan that happened in the 1600s. And in the 1600s, and especially in the city of Nagasaki, they had what we would call an artifact today, a fumi. And the fumi was a ceramic plate with the image of Christ on it, and the cruciform image of Christ, a crucifix on it. And every human being, every man, woman, and child, once a year was expected to step on this and denounce Christ and proclaim that they were not a follower of Jesus. And as you can see there, this Japanese historian, Simon Hull, says if you examine an original fumi closely, one poignant detail is that the face of Christ has been completely worn away, reminding us of the countless feet that would have trampled on it. And in those days, it was terrible persecution, and people were burned and sawn. They would use bamboo saws to saw people, crucify people. They would. And you may have noticed in the movie clip that the person hanging on the cross when the tide was coming in also had boils all over their body, and that's because they would boil them in hot springs. So odds are, in this movie clip, it was meant to portray that there was a hot spring nearby, and so it not only was the salty water and the threat of crucifixion and threat of drowning, but they were being burned at the same time. And this was common practice in those days, and they would be hung in pits. And some of this is stomach-churning stuff, but I feel like our stomachs need to churn every now and then. We need to recognize what people have been through so that we can have what we have nowadays. And they would hang people upside down in pits of their own excrement, and they would cut holes in their temples to allow them to bleed so they could last much, much longer. And this was common, and all you had to do to escape all this suffering was step on the image of Christ in front of a government official. But many, many, many people refused to do that. And it also, the movie brings up the question, and anytime you study persecution and what Christians have been through throughout the ages, an interesting question that comes up is, what do you do when it's not you? What do you do when you're not the one being tortured, but it's your child being tortured, or your mother being tortured, or your neighbors being tortured? And that was pretty common practice in these days too, was they would take a father and say, step on the fumi, or I will do this to your family. And there were many Christians who denounced Christ and stepped on the fumi, and then fought this awful roller coaster of, am I a follower of Christ or not? And it begs the question of am I committed to Christ? And I tend to think God would show a ton of mercy in those days, but there were many who gave in, and there were many who didn't. And we're in the middle of a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. We're calling the MOAS, the mother of all sermons, and as a hill worth dying in a world where it's hard to know where you should plant your flags and what hills are worth defending. The mother of all sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, gives us a lot of details on what's really important in life. And in this particular passage, we've arrived at the place where Jesus says this. He says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." In some sense, the history of Christianity is a history of bloodletting. It's a history of persecution. It's a history of people dying, proclaiming Christ. And we are so blessed that we don't live in those days. And we'll talk about that as we go on. But the historian Tertullian, around 150 AD, this is the bumper sticker version of his quote that says, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." This is what you see on T-shirts and on posters, but this is not actually what the quote says. If you go back to the original language and kind of translate it well, it says, "We multiply when you reap us. The blood of Christians is seed." And the reality is, I sat in the back of the room today and got to observe you guys worshiping God, and we have this amazing sound system and light system and TVs and a drum set, and we get to come in here, and it's almost like a little Jesus party. That's not what most Christians have experienced throughout the ages, and it's because they experienced the fumi, it's because they experienced the persecution and the crucifixions and the flayings that we get to celebrate and we get to party without worrying about who's about to bust through the door. And it's important that we remember that. I think we're going to find as we talk about this how valuable it is that we think about that we allow ourselves to we skip over that part where they would hang people upside down in excrement and allow them to bleed out and die, and we bristle at that, so we try not to think about it. We put it out of our minds, but I think it's important to visualize. It's important to stop and think about what Christians have gone through. And we're going to briefly just go through a history of kind of persecution, and we could talk for hours upon hours upon hours about what Christians have gone through throughout the ages. But we're going to start in the Bible, and the Bible has a bunch of examples of people being persecuted. John the Baptist was one, and John, this is supposedly a picture of Herod Antipas, not to be confused with Herod the Great or King Herod. Herod Antipas was a government leader in Galilee, and John the Baptist had been talking to him about this woman he was about to marry, and he was telling him it wasn't lawful for him to marry her, and the woman was really mad, and more than that, the woman's mom was mad, and so long story short, Herod offered this girl whatever she wanted. Anything you ask is yours. And what did she ask for? The head of John the Baptist on a plate. He was martyred for his faith. He was martyred for his solidarity with God. He gave his life. Stephen the deacon, Stephen was basically feeding the homeless and feeding the hungry, feeding the orphans and widows. He was a deacon over the church in the early church, and he was performing miracles, and he was called in by the religious leaders of his time and put on trial, saying that he was blaspheming, that the message that he was portraying about Jesus being God and being the Messiah was false. And they brought him to trial and said, "Are you proclaiming this?" And he gives this long diatribe, starting with Moses and moving all throughout history, about all the prophets that were persecuted by religious folk. And then he concludes his diatribe with this statement. He says, "Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute?" So when Stephen gives his history in front of the religious leaders, it's a history of persecution that leads up to him. And they start gnashing their teeth, which means this is a Jewish expression that means they were really dang mad at this point. And they took him out and they killed him. James the Greater, which is really funny, because if I called Paul the Greater and some other Paul the Lesser, that would be really weird today. And the reality is, in the early church, James the Greater was actually kind of the lesser, which illustrates an interesting point of Jesus, but it's not the point of today, so we're not going to go into it. But James the Greater, it's a brief passage that we have, but basically for his faith, he was beheaded with a sword, and we know that through Scripture. And then we get to extra biblical texts and some of the early Roman and Christian historians and early church fathers talking about different people who gave their lives. And this was James the Lesser, and James the Lesser was the brother of John. And James was preaching, and the religious leaders weren't very happy about it, and they took him on trial and found out that he wasn't going to back down, and so they took him to the top of the temple, and they threw him off the temple. And the way the story goes, and I did my best to go with sources that are pretty well documented at this point. You can read all kinds of legends about all kinds of stuff about people dying and not dying and being boiled alive and surviving, and there's all kinds of stuff out there. But most of this is pretty well historically attested. And Josephus and Eusebius describe James. They have sort of two stories. Josephus says he was stoned to death, and Eusebius says he was thrown from the temple and then stoned to death. And as the story goes, he survived the fall and managed to make it onto his knees and began praying for his persecutors. And then they say that he was bashed in the head with a fuller's club. And I never know what a fuller's club before, but this is a fuller's club. And Booker, this is one picture in my presentation that I could not get copyright rights for, but please blur it in the video and we will be legal. But a fuller apparently was basically a fabric dyer. And they would take the fabrics and they would wrap them around these clubs, and then they would wring them out as they were dyeing them. So this fuller happened to be there, as the story goes, and as James is being beaten to death with rocks after being thrown from the temple, he finished the job. And that was the death of James the Lesser, the brother of John. Simon Peter, who's attested in various sources, was crucified and crucified upside down, proclaiming that he didn't deserve to die the way his master had, the way his friend had. So Jesus was crucified upright. He said, "I want to be crucified upside down," which is really fascinating when you consider the story of Peter. Because Peter, when he was afraid of being persecuted, when he was afraid of being crucified like Jesus, said this. He began to curse and swear. This was before Jesus was crucified. And basically a handmaid had spotted him and said, "I saw you with Jesus." And he starts cussing her out, saying, "Blankety blank blank, no, you didn't see me with Jesus. I never knew the man," which was something Jesus predicted ahead of time. This was how afraid he was of crucifixion, but something happened to Peter. See, some of this persecution stuff is in my opinion, one of the greatest apologetic arguments for the Christian church is why did these people do what they did? Why were they willing to die? Why be crucified upside down? It's because they had seen something that none of us had the blessing to see. They had seen something supernatural and majestic and it changed their lives. And he went from cussing to prove his lack of faith in front of people or his lack of following or discipleship to being crucified upside down because he didn't deserve to die the way Christ did. Paul's attested to elsewhere, and there's some questions as to how Paul was died, but the most common theory is that he was crucified for his faith, which is super interesting as well because he went from being a giver to a taker. He was giving persecution. There's a passage in Acts, in that passage we talked about where Stephen was stoned to death. Paul was attesting to his death. He was one of the Jewish leaders that killed him, basically. And something happened to Paul, and Paul gave his life up for the Christ. And Paul went so far, he was a religious leader that could have kept persecuting Christians and kept putting them in prison, but something happened to him and something changed his life. And he went from being a giver of persecution to a receiver of persecution. And this is how he describes some of the persecution that he faced. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. And some of you are familiar with this and some of you aren't, but in the Jewish law, the maximum penalty, the maximum corporal penalty you could face was 40 lashes with the whip or with the cat of 9 tails. And the law basically punished any soldier that went beyond that. So if you lashed someone 41 times, you received lashes yourself. So soldiers would always stop at 39 just to make sure. And that's what Paul meant when he said, I received the 40 minus 1. He received 39 lashes 5 times in his life for proclaiming Jesus. 3 times I was beaten with rods, and once I was pelted with stones. And if you know the New Testament, that time he was pelted with stones. He was pelted so severely that his persecutors thought he was dead and dragged him out of the city and left him. This was the person who was persecuting Christians, and then something transformed him to where he was willing to endure all this for the name of Christ. And then we get into past the apostles, the apostolic age, later in history, and up until today. You can look up today, modern persecution of Christians, and horrendous things are happening globally now. But this describes an event that happened in 64 AD, which was the burning of Rome, and Tacitus writes about this in his set, the Annals. He's considered one of the greatest Roman historians that ever lived, and he says that the Christians of his time, he describes them as a multitudinous gens, an immense multitude of Christians that were captured in Rome. They would capture a few Roman Christians, then they would torture those Christians to get the names of all the other Christians, and through that process, they captured what Tacitus describes as an immense multitude of believers in Rome by 64 AD, which is a huge, wonderful apologetic argument that we don't have time for today. But it says they were covered in the skins of beasts and torn by dogs and perished. So they would wrap them in the bloody skins of animals and throw them to the dogs in the Colosseum. And it says they were nailed to crosses, so they were crucified, and they were doomed to the flames. As history seems to show, Nero would illuminate his gardens at night with burning Christians. So as you were walking through Nero's wonderful, beautiful gardens, the reason you could see the enormity of it was because the Christians were burning nearby by 64 AD. And there's so much persecution that, again, we can't cover it all, but by approximately 250 AD, they have what they call the Decidian persecutions under Decius, and this is the way it's described, is that all the inhabitants of the empire were required to sacrifice before the magistrates of their community for, quote, the safety of the empire. So the Romans would come, capture Christians, bring them in and say, worship the Roman gods, and there's going to be dire consequences if you don't. And we know that this was a pretty massive persecution because currently, my understanding is that there are about 43 certificates known, like in people's hands now. So the original proclamation has been lost to history. But if you bowed down to the Roman gods, you were given a certificate saying you had done this and that you were free to roam the land. And they have 43 of those certificates still alive and well today. And then my understanding is there's documented sources saying that at some points the people lining up to get these certificates was so long that they had to cancel the event for the day and say, come back tomorrow. There were lots and lots of Christians during this time that said, sign me up, I'll worship the Roman gods, I'm not going to be persecuted. And we know that we lost at least 3 key church leaders during the Decidian persecutions. Pope Fabian, Babylos of Antioch, and Alexander of Jerusalem are famous Christians and Christian leaders. Possibly the reason people lined up to betray Jesus is how they would have viewed it. They lined up to worship the Roman gods to receive these certificates, is described in this quote. It says, the effects on those who had until then lived peacefully and undisturbed was traumatic. So this wasn't a savage, barbaric world that these people were living in. It was almost like people busted in here today. And that would be a different world than the early church. We're not used to persecution here. The worst persecution we get is somebody posts a meme about our politics on Facebook, and we say we're being persecuted as Christians. These people were being filleted alive. But at this point in history, that wasn't happening. And people lined up to back out of the Jesus thing pretty rapidly. This thing was described as monstrous tyranny. And it's not specified a lot in history what went on during this time, but it was brutal enough where Christians fled the scene quite often. So they either gave in and worshiped the Roman gods, or they left the country. And among those who left was a guy named Cyprian. Cyprian of Carthage was a church leader at that time, and he went into hiding. And he was branded a coward for this by many. And his excuse was that sheep need a shepherd. And so he was hiding and running away in order to shepherd the flock. And then he would also argue that Jesus and Paul and some of the disciples would do the same thing when persecution came. And I actually have a lot of mercy for Cyprian in this occasion. I think he made the right call. I think if you can avoid persecution, you should, which may be a topic for another day. But interestingly enough, he demanded penance from those who had worshiped the Roman gods. So once the persecution died down and he came back, he said, well, if you did this, if you bowed down to the Roman gods, you need to repent of this and show some kind of penance. And it was a pretty harsh penance. So he had this label of kind of being hypocritical because he had fled in cowardice, some described him as, but then he also branded those who bowed down as cowards. But then ultimately, persecution came again, and Cyprian gave his life for Jesus, showing probably that he wasn't a coward after all. And we actually have an account of the trial, a transcript of the trial. And it goes like this. And there's a lot more to it than this. These are the highlights of it. And when he went to trial with the Romans, it says, they said to him, the most sacred emperors have commanded you to conform to the Roman rites. And he says, I refuse. The leader of the tribunal says, take heed for yourself. In other words, do you recognize the danger of what you're saying? He says, do as you are bid. In so clear a case, I may not take heed. Basically, he says, I know what's about to happen, and I'm not going to worship the Roman gods. The tribunal says, the authority of law shall be ratified in your blood, and you will be executed with the sword. And here's his response. Thanks be to God. And I have to think about what I would do in that situation. And thanks be to God is probably pretty low on the list of things that would pop in my head at that time. And you can just read page after page after page of persecution and people dying and being bled for their faith in the first several hundred centuries that Christianity existed. And it goes all the way to the Dark Ages and medieval times, and ultimately you arrive in more modern missionaries and some of the things they had endured. We named our third child after Adoniram Judson. So our son is named Judson, and he's named after this missionary, Judson Andrew Hussman. And Adoniram, his story, boy, you want some amazing reading, read a biography of Adoniram Judson. I mean, wild, wild stuff. But he was convicted and convinced that he wanted to become a missionary to then Burma. And Burma was what they would call an unreached people group. There was no gospel presentation. The message of Jesus was not presented to Burma, which is Myanmar nowadays. But Burma had never heard of Jesus, and he committed his life to telling them about Jesus. And so he moved. Long, long story, brutal story. The sacrifices this man made were ridiculous, but he ultimately transcribed the scriptures from the original language into the Burmese language. So he moved to Burma, learned their language, transcribed the scriptures, and today the only version in the Burmese or Myanmarian, I'm not sure if that's the right word or not, but the only version in their language is the one that he did. He's still the only person who's ever done it to this day. And he was so hated by the Burmese that they at one point kept him for 11 months. And for those 11 months, they kept him and it was in mosquito-infested jungle with 90 degrees at night, 100% humidity. And they would wrap his legs around an iron bar and raise that iron bar off the ground just far enough to where his shoulders could barely touch the ground. And that's how he slept for 11 months of his life, because he wanted so desperately for the Burmese people to hear the message of a Savior that had come that loved them. And he's not alone. And there's a lot of people nowadays that are giving up their lives and giving up their well-being for faith. Richard Wurmbrand, you may have heard of. He's a fairly famous Christian. I don't want to say martyr because he didn't actually lose his life, but he's very famous for his work with modern-day martyrs and praying for the martyred church and spearheading political movements to help martyred people. And he was until his passing in 2001. But he was a Romanian Lutheran pastor during Soviet-occupied Romania, a Soviet-occupied Romanian period in history. And at a time when a lot of the Christian church was kind of, they would describe as bowing down to the party and becoming the Russian Orthodox Church, and in his opinion, kind of betraying the values of Christianity, he was a person standing up against it and saying, I will not bow down, I will not cave in, Christ, 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 Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And they hated him for it. And he spent 10 years of his life in prison, and 3 of those years were in solitary confinement in a 12-foot cell with no light. It was underground, no light, no windows, 3 years solitary confinement. He's written a book called Prayer from Solitary Confinement, or Prayers from Solitary Confinement, which I haven't read, but I've seen excerpts from. It's pretty fascinating. But how do you maintain your sanity? I rode in a car yesterday for about 4 hours and was about to go out of my gourd. And I was listening to music and hanging out, and my wife was with me and my son was with me, and even still, 4 hours in a car, driving me crazy. 3 years with no light, no other sound except the occasional Morse code that he would receive from other prisoners. They would communicate through Morse code by tapping on the walls, and occasionally could do this. Lousy food, disease situation, 3 years because he failed to bow down. He was tortured. They would wrap his feet over, again, iron bars and raise him up off the ground and then beat the bottoms of his feet with clubs until it would go to bone. And then they would take him back to his cell, drag him back to his solitary confinement cell and drop him off and come back and do it the next day. They would burn him. They would force him to stand. So they had these boxes built that were about coffin-sized, and they would put him inside and close the door. And so you had to stand like this, but the difference about this coffin-sized box was there were sharp nails driven in every single spot of the entire box. And so if you moved at all, you were cutting into your flesh. And they would put him in there for hours and even days at a time. And all he had to do were 2 things. 1, renounce Christ, and 2, give up the names of other Christians that he knew about. 10 years he endured this because he refused to do those things. They would also put him in a refrigeration box for hours at a time and nearly take his life. And you may have seen in the news this horrific image of the 21 Coptic Christians in Egypt in 2015, in Libya. I'm sorry. And my understanding of the event, thankfully the videos are unavailable at this time, but my understanding of what is revealed in those videos is a couple of things. One, these were construction workers who were Christians that were taken by ISIL and taken to a beach and given the opportunity to renounce their faith and refused to do so. So they were all beheaded right there on that beach. One day they're working a construction site. A couple days later they're gone. This is 2015. This isn't 15 AD. This is 2015 AD. And you can read about 2016 and 17 and 18, 19 and 20, and it's still going on today. And there's a story that circulates about this story, and I haven't seen the videos. You never know what's true and what's not, but the story is that there was a prisoner from Chad. It was an African man, a black guy, among a bunch of Middle Eastern men. And so when you see the video, this man stands out as different than the others. And the story goes that he was a non-believer that started mixing it up with these Christians, and he was dragged off with the other 20 Christians and given a chance to recant Jesus. And it would have been super easy for him to do so. But his final comment was, their religion is my religion. Something about these men had encouraged him and inspired so much that he gave his life up that day, even though by all recollections, he was not a Christian previously. But the name of Jesus, he saw it. He saw something happening and gave his life. And so, wow, we are almost out of time. Holy smokes. This may last a while. I got a puddle of mud I'm going to fly through when it comes to persecution. And I'm going to start skipping some stuff. The first is, can we relate to this at all? I was talking to my friend Mike Hawk this week about this topic, and when Jesus said these words, blessed are the persecuted, he was talking to a highly persecuted people that also believed that persecution and being downtrodden was kind of a mark against their faith. The Jewish people, and this is a topic for another day, but the Jewish people kind of had this mentality that when all is going well, that's a sign of God's blessing, and when all is going bad, it's a sign of God's cursing. Many people believe that, and And these were the people that Jesus was conveying this message to, that blessed are the persecuted, were the people who were persecuted. So this was kind of mind-blowing stuff to them. He was saying, you are blessed. Blessing is something else, and it's here right now. So when it comes to the original audience, it was hard for them to receive. And then when it comes to us, Mike mentioned this week. He said, persecution is the last thing in our minds. We just don't even think about it. I mean, what we label as persecution, oftentimes it just pales in comparison to what the historic church has gone through. So puddle of mud stuff, the actuaries ain't wrong. Here's what I mean by that. If you buy a life insurance, it's because, they set a rate. They've set the rate because some actuary has sat down with tables, or armies of actuaries have sat down with tables saying, what are your odds of dying of this disease or that disease, or kidney malfunction or cancer, or being hit by a car or suicide, and they calculate over the course of humanity and current averages, what are the odds, and what are the odds you're going to live one more day based on your current blood pressure and physical health and so forth. And so the actuaries are the ones who set the prices. And here's what you find. You find in the actuary tables things like heart disease and stroke and lung infections and lung obstruction and diarrhea and HIV and lung cancer and diabetes and road accidents and so forth. And here's what I want to point out is that crucifixion is nowhere on this list. Being boiled in hot springs is nowhere on this list. Being hung upside down in excrement is no longer on this list. It's just not, it's not even conceivable in the world that we live in right now. It's so hard for us to connect with what people have gone through. And I think we need to examine ourselves because we use things like #blessed. And Jesus describes a different kind of blessing. You know, the only time you see #blessed is when somebody has a nice cup of coffee and their fuzzy slippers on, right? But that's not historically, that is blessed. And in my opinion, that is God's desire for each and every one of us, is that we avoid persecution, that we avoid suffering. But we don't want to discount the fact that people throughout history have been blessed in an entirely different way. So to quote my 12-year-old, we should be like, thank you. You should be like, and he was like, and they were like, we should be like, thank you. We should be thankful for our thriving and thankful for the gift that people gave us. You get to sit here today and listen to this gospel message in peace, partially because people early on were willing to die. There's a lot of other reasons. I've heard it said that you can put your head on a pillow soundly at night because gruff men are willing to do violence on your behalf. People have died for your right to be freedom in a country that's free. But the reason the gospel has been proclaimed throughout the centuries is because people who were willing to stand up against tyrants and die for the message. And we need to be thankful for that. It needs to be something that hits us at home and sinks in somehow, because we have a poor perspective, which I thought was pretty clever. It changed our perspective. When you realize what people have gone throughout history, it changes your perspective on just how #blessed you really are. And we are blessed in a material way, and we are blessed in a comfort way. And you know, we've seen the videos of first world problems where a guy says, man, I hate it when they forget to put my pickles on my sandwich when I distinctly said I wanted pickles. And we think our life is ruined at this point. I saw this clip, this news thing this week, news article about a Montana family that built their dream home and went away and came back to find cows had snuck in and lived in their house for a few weeks while they were gone. That's nothing compared to being boiled alive, but it is bad news. It's a pretty terrible situation. But this is what Paul wrote. He said, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. And I want to point out this. He describes the suffering he endured as a light momentary affliction. Let's go back to what he endured. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes. It doesn't say that those who are blessed are those who are persecuted for entitlement or those who are persecuted for being buttheads, because Christians today can be, quote, persecuted for either. So when we think about what people have gone through and we think about the level of persecution, we stuck a bunch of yard signs all over Louisville when we launched Daylight Church to let people know we were here. And eventually the zoning commission contacted me and said, hey, you can't do that, right? Now, if I'm an entitled butthead Christian, I'm going to say, you're only doing this because we're a church. You're going to hell, mister, right? I mean, this is how Christians think sometimes, and they act like absolute buttheads, and then they're hated for it, and they think I'm so blessed because I'm persecuted. No, you're just a butthead. So So we need to put a perspective on what are we fighting and dying for? Is it the message of the cross? Is it the message of Jesus? And sometimes you are persecuted and you have to stand up. But oftentimes it's because you're wasting time standing around the water cooler at church water cooler at work and sharing the gospel with somebody when you're supposed to be sitting at your desk and getting some work done. And there's just a difference. And you have to be careful about your perspective. And I want to encourage you not to hide. One of the messages buried in this thing is that you shouldn't be overly concerned with what people think. Hello, my name is people pleaser is not your name tag. So even though we may not be crucified, even though we may not be burned at the stake like many were, the message here is don't be afraid of people's opinions. This is part of the message of persecution, is that you have to figure out what you believe, you have to study, you have to embrace, and then you have to live it out kind of without fear. And not be scared of people hating you, not be scared of people calling you holy roller or bashing you on social media or whatever it is that happens to you. And so it's a first world kind of persecution, but it's still very real, the effect. And there's so much more to be said about trauma and what it means to be traumatized and how these Christians must have been traumatized, because trauma often is tied into a loss of control and not being able to fight back, and they couldn't. But it's a story for another day. Again, puddle of mud, man. I'm just going through some stuff that was in my head when it came to persecution. Number 38:11, whatever it is to get coached. There's this passage in Hebrews that says, therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. When you're afraid to stand up, let's say you're new to the faith and you're starting to make some decisions. You're going to Bible study, for example, something that simple. And your family just doesn't understand why you would want to go to Bible study, so they're giving you grief about it. Well, at some point, you got to think, Christians have endured this stuff. This is par for the course for Christianity. Some people are not going to understand, and it has always been that way, and it always will be that way. But you are #blessed in that they're not beating you with sticks over it. They're just giving you grief. And that's pretty tolerable in comparison. So stand up and run the race that's been set before you, and let the martyrs speak to you. This question has haunted me since I started preparing this sermon, is how firmly has this gospel grasped me? Like, how desperate would I be to get the scriptures in the hands of the Burmese people? Like, does that kind of thing even haunt me? Do I value the scriptures? Do I value the message of Jesus so much that I would ever put myself in a dangerous situation? And I don't know the answers to this question. I don't know. I'd like to think so. I may be wrong. But I think we need to explore this within ourselves that says, allow the martyrs to convict us. Allow the martyrs to face off with us and say, how dedicated are you to this thing really? If the Fumi comes along in Japan and they're going to hang you upside down in excrement, are you going to step on that thing or not? If your family says, why are you going to Bible study? Are you going to go to Bible study or not? Totally different levels, but same mentality. And I am going to close with, I'm going to skip some stuff. Here we go. If you would pull out your mobile devices or your Bibles and turn to 1 Peter 4 with me. Starting in verse 12 of 1 Peter 4, it says, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. In other words, when your family says to you, why are you going to a Bible study? Don't be shocked at that. It's happened throughout the ages. It's always going to happen. It says, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. And so it talks about entrusting your soul to God in moments when it's hard, in moments when you're persecuted, in moments when people don't understand. Joan of Arc, it said, when she died, said, I die for speaking the language of angels. And I want to close with this question, is what would you be willing to die for? Because you're going to live for something, and when you die, you're going to die for that thing for which you have lived. What's it going to be? And I think this question of how firmly have I grasped this gospel thing needs to be something that haunts us a little bit. When we think about the martyrs and what they endured, and we think about our own lives, I think we need to step into that, visualize it, feel it, and embrace it, and let it shape and change us.